Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Chris from the University of Washington. He is a physician, a professor, an entrepreneur, but one of the biggest things is he's known for his work in the microbiome field, and he's going to be on here today talking to us about his expertise.
Thanks for having me on the show. My passion is impacting people's health in a positive way through the gut. I'm a gastroenterologist and haven't always been a gastroenterologist, but my friends and family would joke that I've always had a sense of humor that might lend itself well for the profession. And when people ask me, well, why the heck did you become a gastroenterologist? I'll usually give them a tongue-in-cheek answer like that. But the truth is, the gut is really at the center of our health. It is the core of our body, but it's also where all of our nutrients are absorbed and where we fight off a lot of the invading organisms that are trying to get a free meal off of us, so to speak. So viruses and bacteria that make us sick. And it actually plays a really important role in our brain as well, and making sure that our memory works, as well as modulating our mood and our appetite. So all of those things conspire to inspire me to use the gut to help better our health. And Hippocrates said it well, let food be thy medicine. Nonetheless, I think that's so true. And we're learning that it's not as simple as just the nutrients that are in food, but how the microorganisms within our gut, largely within our colon, serve as a bioreactor and transform those nutrients into other factors, so-called metabolites or postbiotics, that are also really important for our health. It's a fascinating story that's unfolding in the most avant-garde research. And my mission through a blog that I keep is to try to bring that most current research directly to people so that they can be inspired to improve their health as well through interventions that impact their microbiome, their gut health, and largely through food, but certainly not exclusively.
If I were making a cartoon character of a gut microbiome, what would that character look like and what would its personality be?
I'm looking at the beautiful rainbow jellyfish, and I'm not sure if that's an octopus or a kraken or a squid. I mean, here in Seattle, we come from Kraken territory, the hockey team. It's called the Kraken. I could imagine actually the microbiome almost being like a rainbow within the gut. I think rainbow is a beautiful depiction of diversity. And the gut in health truly is a diverse ecosystem. It's not all that different from a vibrant coral reef or a rainforest. In the countless organisms, thousands of different species that are present and that coexist in a very harmonious way in health. And it's not that way when we get sick, and it's that lack of diversity, quite frankly, and the lack of cooperation between organisms that can contribute to gut dysfunction, and that ultimately contributes to dysfunction in the whole body. So yeah, maybe it would be kind of a rainbow of different species, lots of different colors, kind of all in a beautiful array.
So how would you define the microbiome's personality?
I think the microbiome has many different dimensions to it. And you and I are complex too. There's different sides to all of our personalities. If somebody asks you, are you an extrovert or an introvert? And I always have a hard time answering that question because it depends on the circumstance, right? It depends on the context, how different elements of personality come forward. And that's kind of true for the microbiome as well. The context in the case of the microbiome is the food that you give it and how much you exercise and what your stress levels are and how well you sleep. What I call the 4 M's, molecules, microbes, movement, and mind. We can maybe talk more about that, but those are the environmental factors, the pillars of health that are impacting your microbiome. And when you give supporting pillars of health, the microbiome will in turn support you in healthful ways. But if you are less active, spend more time on the couch, more time watching screens, feeding it foods that it doesn't like so much, or if you're stressed or not sleeping, then what might otherwise be a healthy microbiome can show another side to itself because the barrier in your gut breaks down and they might not be as cooperative then. They might become hangry, so to speak. When they don't get fed, and what they like to eat are the leftovers from the foods that we eat, and those are things like fibers and polyphenols, they get hangry and they start looking for a meal elsewhere. And sometimes that's the mucus that our gut makes in health and the lining of our gut. And that can contribute to inflammation. And inflammation is one of the roots of disease.
So, some people may think of the gut microbiome, if they've heard of it, that, okay, if I eat something bad, my tummy might hurt.
Mhm.
Could you explain how exercise influences the gut microbiome?
So, health in the microbiome, disease in the microbiome is a two-way street. So, just as much as your gut and the way that you treat it impacts things like your brain and your moods and your metabolism and your muscles in exercise, the amount that you exercise impacts your gut microbiome. It really goes both ways. It's kind of a chicken or the egg phenomena. Which came first, or which impacts which? Is the gut microbiome that is helping you be more fit, or is being more fit helping your microbiome? It's both. But to give you an example of both directions, there's some really interesting research that's shown that certain athletes, endurance athletes, those that run marathons, for example, have a higher number of certain species that like to break down, consume lactic acid. And that's one of the byproducts of endurance exercise. And that might help them be more fit and able to run those long miles. And there's even companies that are trying to capitalize on that and giving that particular organism to people to see if they can make them more fit as well. So that's an example of how exercise can impact your gut microbiome, but it goes the other way too. If you feed your gut microbiome right with whole foods that have fiber and polyphenols to contribute to their diversity, they cooperate to turn those things into factors like butyrate that then positively impact all of the power generating organelles within your cells, the so called mitochondria. You can think of them like little factories. The butyrate that the microbiome is making fundamentally turns on and off the genes that are responsible for turning on and off those factories, whether or not they're made, how well they're recycled, how well they're maintained. When the microbiome isn't fed right, those mitochondria, the energy generating organelles in each and every one of our cells, doesn't work as well. That impacts our brain, but it also impacts our muscle health. When our muscles don't work as well, we can't run as fast, or we can't do gymnastics as well, or whatever sports is your passion, your muscles just don't work as well for it. So the microbiome and treating it right is actually really important for our endurance and our fitness as well.
Butyrate and polyphenol are chemicals that our
Mhm.
body produces from food that we're eating.
Yeah. So the food that we eat has, you could call them phytochemicals. That's basically just plant chemicals. And these are good chemicals. Polyphenols are one of those, not the only thing that are in plants that are healthy. Another would be fiber. And our microbiome takes those chemicals and converts them into, you can think of them like activated chemicals, ones that really positively impact our cells. So it takes fiber, for example, and turns that into butyrate, which is you could think of it like the activated chemical. And it takes polyphenols and turns them into modified polyphenols that can get absorbed and that can impact your mitochondria. So, yeah, it's not just about what you eat, but it's how healthy your microbiome is and how it converts those things that are leftovers that you don't absorb and that feed them instead into healthy molecules. It's almost like bacterial poop that fertilizes our cells, right? It's good poop.
So, another expertise that you have is something that you call functional food.
Mhm.
Can
So, we're in a bit of a crisis right now, you might say, when it comes to the health of the population. And if you look at charts of overweight, obesity, diabetes, metabolic disease in general, the lines are going up, 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 up with each year. That begs the question, well, why the heck is that happening? And there's a lot of things that are conspiring to make that happen. You know, less exercise, maybe in the context of COVID. But a big contributor also is the types of foods that we're eating. And historically, what we had access to were largely whole foods. And we would cook those whole foods and make meals from them. And over time, we have developed more and more foods that are already cooked for us, already processed for us, that are more convenient. Those have served a really important function for feeding a rapidly growing population. But there's collateral damage. And that collateral damage is to produce those foods, a lot of the healthy things have been taken out, things that we didn't really recognize as being healthy or important. And those would be the fibers and the polyphenols. Those foods also get concentrated for things that would be healthy, but we're eating way too much of. And that would be simple sugars and salts and saturated fats. They're not inherently bad. It's just in a lot of the foods that we're getting, the processed foods, there's too much of those. And really, it's important to achieve a balance between the different nutrients. And that balance is thrown off by a lot of the processing that happens. Now, what are functional foods? Functional foods are foods where we pay attention to those things that have been taken out and we add them back. And that way you can achieve the benefit of processing things like the foods last longer. They can be less expensive than having to refrigerate something that would otherwise be perishable. And it's kind of a pragmatic approach to nutrition, recognizing that a future of going to an entirely whole food diet probably isn't going to happen. We should continue to really emphasize and stress whole foods and get as many as we can. But if we can make the convenient foods, the processed foods, incrementally better, then I think that's a big win. And so the processed foods that have these ingredients added back to them, I would call those the functional foods and the ones that are better for you than a lot of the foods that are currently available out there.
Could you give an example of one of those foods?
If you go to like a Whole Foods supermarket or one of the big chain supermarkets that have a lot of these new products and you just look at the labels, one clue as to it being something that might be more functional would be seeing the amount of fiber that's in the processed food, just in the nutrition facts label. And if that fiber is comparing it to the overall carbohydrates, if it's at least 10-1 in the ratio, and ideally 5-1, then that would be a better food to eat. You'll see
So,
a lot of foods making claims on the packaging saying, we've got tons of fiber, or this will help your gut health, and things like that. And I take that all with a grain of salt, not literally, because we want to moderate our salt. It's hard to, with all of the chatter around gut health, it's hard to know which of these foods really are better for you than others. One of the things I've been working on is a simple metric for how healthy a food is that's based on how balanced it is and its nutrients. Going back to that idea of it's not bad, it's not good, but it's how nutrients are balanced with each other. I mentioned the balance of carbohydrates and fiber. That's one of the really important ones, but not the only one. I've been working on this calculator that does that effortlessly for you, and it integrates all the different ratios and then provides a quality measure of that food on a scale from 1 to 100. And when you look at the way it works, if you plug in a whole food like a yam or a cucumber, for example, those whole foods will score very well. And if you put in something like Fruit Loops or even Rice Krispies, those will score very poorly. Those are both very processed foods. The functional foods will score somewhere in between. And that's because they have some of these important things added back. And so rather than relying on the flashy packaging and the claims that you see, which can sometimes be helpful, sometimes misleading, or having to decipher the nutrition facts label. And, even for a gastroenterologist or nutritionist, those can be difficult to make sense of. But first of all, they're super tiny. So I find myself squinting, trying to even see the numbers, let alone, make sense of them. This calculator would really do that for you and give you a number on a scale from 1 to 100, indicating how healthy that food is. And it gives you a quick and easy measure of, well, is this cereal better for me or is that cereal better for me? And so on.
One of the molecules that we hear a lot about in the public these days is glucose.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are your beliefs on glucose's role in our microbiome?
Well, in terms of the microbiome, glucose isn't the healthiest thing. In terms of our own bodies and our own cells, it's absolutely critical. The way things normally work is when it comes to glucose, you eat a plant, whatever that plant might be, a potato, broccoli, and it has starch in it. And starch is just a collection of glucose molecules all strung together. And your body's enzymes that are made in the pancreas, they mix in the small intestine as soon as that food leaves your stomach and starts breaking down that starch. As it turns out, the starch is actually already starting to break down even with the saliva in your mouth and some of the secretions in the stomach, but it really happens in force once it hits the small intestine with the pancreas juices that are released there. So that takes that whole string of glucose, the starch molecule, breaks it down into little glucose molecules. And it's those little glucose molecules that can get absorbed into your body. And those glucose molecules feed the neurons in your brain, feed the little muscle cells that help you move, and so on. Super important. Glucose is one of the major nutrient currencies in our body. Now, what's the relationship between glucose and our microbiome? Most of that glucose, most of that starch is absorbed in health before it starts hitting the full force of the microbiome, which is in the lower intestine. Starts in the small intestine, the lower part of the small intestine, but then in full force in the colon. And if you have too much glucose or simple sugars, right? So that'd be like table sugar, then that's going to feed the wrong types of microbes higher up in the gut. And those microbes will tend to be more inflammatory in general, will break down the barrier of the gut a little bit and will lead to inflammation in the body. So simple sugar, simple glucose, beyond just moderation, is not a good thing for your microbiome. Your microbiome prefers the complex carbohydrates, the ones where all those sugars are strung together, like in fibers and like in resistant starch, and less so the simple glucose molecules.
Have you done any research on how the microbiome impacts different diseases such as cancers or IBD?
Yes. So most of my research has been in inflammatory bowel disease or IBD. IBD, you have real inflammation that you can see when you take biopsies of the colon, whereas IBS, biopsies look normal. And there's can still be dysfunction in the microbiome, but it's not translating into inflammation in the lining of the colon. So yeah, I've done research in that realm. I've done research in the realm of obesity and diabetes and metabolic disease and the microbiome. But the microbiome is being connected to lots of different diseases, like you say, cancer and neurological disease, something be involved in so many different things. And if you understand how the chemicals, like you were saying, that the microbiome is making gets absorbed into the body and how those regulate the energy generating organelles in each and every one of our cells. And it starts to make sense how it can be involved in so many different diseases, because those organelles are fundamental to the health of any cell, right? Whether it's a cancer cell, a brain cell, a pancreas cell, etc.
So in school, most people will learn that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Let's think of the mitochondria as another one of our cartoon characters. How would we describe the mitochondria and its role and personality in our body?
Hmm. I think the mitochondria. So, first of all, yes, you're right. The mitochondria is the powerhouse, but it does a lot more. We're learning it's involved in cell regulation and et cetera. But to keep things simple, let's just think of it like a furnace, right? It's generating energy and heat for our cells. Now, if I could give it a personality, I'd say it's very pragmatic. Right? Let's get down to brass tacks. What are cells for anyway? They're for taking the energy of the food that we eat and transforming that into work. That work can be how we think. It can be how we move, how we grow. And the mitochondria are right there at the center of that story. They're the ones that take the nutrients that we eat and convert them into the key currency that our cells use to do all those things. That's ATP. ATP is almost like an electron in a wire. It's just as we can take things like coal and gas, burn them to produce electricity that then gets distributed to all of our houses through the power lines. The energy that we eat instead of coal, the carbohydrates, for example, get burned, literally oxidized by our mitochondria. And instead of being turned into moving electrons in a power line, get turned into ATP. And ATP is just like those electrons, it's what powers our cells.
One of your articles that you published not too long ago speaks about the mitochondria's responsibility in burning calories.
Mhm.
How do healthy mitochondrias burn calories more efficiently than what you would call an unhealthy mitochondria?
So, mitochondrial health is dependent on a lot of things. One of those things is mitochondria get old. And if they're not effectively recycled, broken down, and then rebuilt as new mitochondria, they don't work as well. There's a fancy word for that. It's called mitophagy. A lot of those molecules that the microbiome is making is important for that, so that our mitochondria are always being renewed. They're always healthy. They're always young. Other things that are important for mitochondrial health would be things like the vitamins that we eat. So, B vitamins in particular, B1, 2, 3, B complex altogether, those are absolutely critical for our mitochondria taking things like carbohydrates, sugars, and turning them into ATP. Without those cofactors, they can't. Exercise impacts how healthy our mitochondria are. When our mitochondria are old, they don't work as well. They don't convert that energy as well. Rather than being able to efficiently convert that energy, the cells end up having to store that energy and they store it as fat. So when our mitochondria don't work as well, we actually build up more fat. When they work better, we tend to produce more energy. We might have more vitality, more energy for exercise. And it turns out people that are more metabolically healthy might actually have a slightly higher body temperature too. So they produce more heat as well. This isn't on the order of degrees, it's on the order of fractions of degrees. But over time, that can add up. So when your mitochondria are healthy, you burn a little bit hotter, so to speak.
We do know that the mitochondria, as you said, ages. So the foods that we're eating, based off of your functional food methods,
Mhm.
how would we understand how that could maybe slow down the process of our mitochondria aging?
A lot of the research around mitochondrial health and the foods that we eat actually has focused on polyphenols. polyphenols, we were talking about rainbows before, and what would the microbiome look like? Well, healthy food looks like a rainbow as well, literally. And what imparts all of those colors to the food are largely the polyphenols. So you think of purple grape, that is a polyphenol, anthocyanins, that give it that color, that give wine their color, red wine, for example, or purple cabbage or strawberries, on and on. And we're learning that polyphenols, just like butyrate and the fiber converted into that molecule, are important for helping recycle our mitochondria and for growing healthy mitochondria. So you ask, well, what should our food look like? It should look like the rainbow. It's simple, just like the metaphor of what should the gut microbiome look like, the rainbow. The more diverse the colors of food that you eat, the more diverse the microbiome that you grow, and the better that microbiome is able to convert the bioactive factors in food into the functional outputs that healthily regulate our mitochondria.
Well, we're going to stop off at the mitochondria. What is the mitochondria? Maybe something that you're thinking about right now. Well, if you still have questions from this episode, I encourage you to be a scientist and send those questions into the comments section, and we could dive a little deeper into simplifying them next week on Tuesday. We have a second part of this episode with Dr. Chris, where he's going to be discussing a little bit more about what are some of the things that you can do in your everyday life that can benefit your microbiome and mitochondria health. Until next time, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your family and friends.